They were pioneers of the RPG genre, a true paladin amongst black knights and a source of light in an hour of darkness. At a time when fast action games and platformers ruled the land, they offered an alternative, games driven by character development, dialogue, and story. Though few in numbers, fans for these games stood at attention with pride and loyalty. And as they developed title after title, more and more dedicated fans joined the ranks under their leadership. Until one day, a switch to a new console and a groundbreaking game sent aftershocks in the gaming world, and the developer became among legends. However, the company's history is riddled with a number of shaky ventures, including a box office bomb, borderline game plagiarism, and even the creation of the company itself. Few know that this large corporation almost ended just before it got off the ground. Truly, like a phoenix rising from the ashes, they nearly swooned before anyone had seen the glimmer of their symbol. And yet, through the ashes and through the years, many have come to know this symbol in the eloquent shape by which it bears its name. Square. In the early 1980s, the video game industry was on such a rapid rise that it seemed that there was no end in sight. Arcade successes like Pac-Man and Donkey Kong were fueling the fire of an already out-of-control flame, while the home console market seemed like it was a well that would never go dry. Little did they know, this flame was about to drown them all. In just a few years, the once towering structure of the industry came crashing down. On the home front, an oversaturation of consoles and an influx of poorly crafted games had sunk consumer confidence, while in the arcades, stock for the largest developer, Atari, plummeted, and interest in the video game as an entertainment medium began to disintegrate. Just like many other things in the 80s, video games appeared to be just another passing fad quickly going out of style. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the gaming industry in Japan was marching right along. Though some of their arcade exports began to slow, it wasn't enough to stop gaming in Japan altogether. Compared with the American market, Japan was relatively unmoved. Developers continued to make games, and the Japanese public continued to buy. In fact, in 1983, just as the American market crashed, Nintendo had released the Famicom to a welcoming Japanese audience. It was becoming evident that Japan was going to lead the gaming market. In fact, at the time, Japan was leading the world in technological advancements, the manufacturing of vital mechanical hardware, as well as a number of other exports. Notably, exports were just a part of their economic boom. Since the end of World War II, a concentration of time and research went into evolving technology specifically for the Japanese public. This focus over the course of 30 years rose to a financial prosperity by the early 80s. It was to such a degree that many believed that Japan would eventually rule the world through its technology. In 1982, Ridley Scott's Blade Runner exemplified this idea by drawing a straight line from the early 80s to a future dominated by Japanese culture. As the gaming market in Japan grew, new small game producers also began to spring up, including a little-known developer called Square. In the beginning, Square was actually not its own company, but rather a branching offshoot of a powerline construction company called Denyu-sha. Square's inception began with a young man named Masashi Miyamoto. Although Masashi has the same surname as Nintendo's Shigeru Miyamoto, there is no relation. Rather, his familial tie is with the owner of Denyu-sha, his father. Once Masashi graduated from university, he had an idea to start his own video game software company. Approaching his father with the idea, he proposed that he could use the company's resources to fund a new venture, and given the booming market, they would stand to make a great profit. His father agreed, and in 1983, Square was born. To Masashi's credit, his thoughts on game development were innovative for the time. Usually, a game was developed by only one individual, and they would have the sole responsibility for forming and creating everything within a particular game, including programming, music, and design. For this reason, many games at the time featured kid songs for music and simplistic storylines. Masashi opted to replace this model with a more collaborative approach by hiring dedicated employees to work on specific aspects of game production. As the department wasn't very large, he hired just a handful of college students as part-time employees to work on the games. One of these new hires was a young Hironobu Sakaguchi. At first, Square chose to avoid consoles and develop games exclusively for the PC. Their earliest works were The Death Trap and the cleverly titled Will, The Death Trap 2. These games were similar to text-based adventures with one main difference. Rather than a textual response to a player's input, they offered graphical feedback using still images. Despite the innovation, both games were released to disappointing sales. Their initial desire to evade consoles could not be sustained, as low sales of their Death Trap series left them trapped. Although not an artistic way to make money, they grudgingly decided to make up for lost profits by porting PC games to the Famicom. Their first port was the PC action game Thexter, which by the way is easily one of the best games on the PC in 1985. However, Thexter's popularity didn't equate to financial gain, as porting software was not an extremely lucrative venture, nor was it what Square set out to be. Worse still, they were 3 years into Square's life, and the department was quickly becoming dead weight to an otherwise successful construction company. Respectfully, Masashi began to transition Square as an independent company from Denyu-sha, but not before giving his company a little extra assurance and a little help from their friends. Masashi contacted other small local developers in hope of creating a potential fellowship of mutual support. The thought was that by banding together, they could better contend with the aggressive marketplace, benefiting all parties involved, especially Square. Thus, in July of 1986, the Disc Original Group, or DOG, was formed. Since Square had arranged the union, every game DOG produced would be published under Square, whether Square actually created it or not. With this strength in numbers established, Square had a strong enough wind to ride on, and so it was time to leave the nest. In September, 1 month after DOG was formed, Square broke away from Denyu-sha and officially became Square Company Limited. With the formation of DOG and their corporate independence, Square exuded a newly found confidence in their ability to mark their name in stone. This was evident in their actions as they requested their part-time employees to commit full-time to the company and begin work on original games that they would publish internationally. Sakaguchi and others gratefully accepted and dropped out of college. Meanwhile, Square pushed on. They hired an in-house composer, Nobu Erimatsu, to create music for these original games. With the completed staff and the support of DOG, they rekindled their flame and forged anew. They burst onto the Famicom with their first original game for the platform, King's Knight, developed by Sakaguchi and composed by Erimatsu. King's Knight, despite its suggestive title, was not actually an RPG. Rather, it was a vertical scrolling shooter set in medieval times where the hero shot swords at enemies, and trees, and mountains, and everything else. This being the first Square release to arrive in America, the game saw some success, but it didn't slice through the competition like they had hoped, especially considering many other companies were releasing a slew of scrolling shooters at that time. Still, it wasn't enough to dash their determination. As well as their original games, including the release of their erotic space adventure, Alpha, Square continued to make a reasonable profit by porting popular PC games like Dragon Slayer and Appletown Story to the MSX and the Famicom Disk System respectively. Although Square was driven to produce great games, it's becoming clear that something was missing. Their loss at speaking to a particular audience was clear to the fact that they struggled to find a distinct voice amongst all the other developers in Japan. This is despite having a talented team and the support of the DOG union. Square continued to press on though, determined to find that voice. However, the next few releases seemed to only showcase their absent uniqueness. 3D World Runner and Rad Racer were yet another attempt at the action genre. Again, the same team Sakaguchi and Erimatsu created both titles, and also Square's ambition is definitely evident in the push towards cutting-edge tech for both games. For instance, the 3D World Runner had a 3D option that switched to a stereoscopic display and shipped with 3D glasses. Similarly, Rad Racer also came with 3D glasses and was specifically made for the short-lived Famicom 3D system, which was only available in Japan. In addition, these two games saw North American releases on the NES. Both games met with decent sales, but something was clearly not right with the two. Namely, both games greatly resembled Sega titles. 3D World Runner looked a lot like the Sega arcade classic Space Harrier, particularly when compared to the home console release. Also, Rad Racer, although being one of the first racing games on the NES, bore a striking resemblance to Sega's racing game Outrun. For these two games, side-by-side comparisons reveal that the games were, to say the least, greatly influenced by the Sega titles. Artistically, this was further painting Square into a corner of unoriginality. This was only compounded when Square released their first and only movie the game adaptation for James Cameron's film Aliens, which, as another program that covered this topic mentioned, resembled many of the other arcade side-scrolling classics that were out at the time. The mixed reviews for the games and the low reception in the market left Square nearly dismantled. The recently hired staff at Square began to get nervous. Their games just weren't selling. And for staff members like Sakaguchi, the thought of returning to college and leaving the gaming industry altogether was quickly becoming a pressing decision to make. Even the union that Square helped create was not going to be enough to save the company. Less than a year after its inception, the developing union, DOG, was put to sleep, and Square was out in the cold. Facing dire straits, Square had only two options: try at least one last time, or quit altogether. Due to the poor overall sales, Square would not only have to develop a hit game, they would need to make a mega hit game, something that they had been unable to accomplish up until this point. Despite these dark times, Square decided to focus all of the remaining resources in developing one final game. Would this be the swan song of an ambitious company that simply couldn't compete in the industry? Or would this last-ditch effort actually save the company from complete collapse? Tune in next time to see all of Square's fantasies come true. I'm Josh Drew. Thanks for watching.